Today I'll tell you a little bit about my research on bilingualism and multilingualism, and with a particular lens towards brain development and how the brain functions and how the brain is structured. So those of us who teach, I teach classes at UW, and we are in our week before finals. So I'm going to start with a multiple choice question. When do kids start to learn language? Is it at about 12 months of age when they say their first words? Is it around 2 years of age when they start to string words together? Is it at birth or is it before birth? What do you guys think?
C or D?
D.
D.
C or D?
D.
It's D. It's D. So if you're curious as to what that might sound like, so in the last month of pregnancy, they actually can hear through the womb. And if you're curious as to what that might sound like, you can take a bath and submerge yourself and have somebody talk. So it's like underwater hearing. It's not perfect, but what they can gain through that are some rhythmic distinctions between different languages. And so we see that that baby has a pacifier in their mouth, and so what you can do at birth is you can measure the infant's sucking rate. And based on their sucking rate, we can actually determine if they can hear differences between different languages, right? So with a newborn, you can't do a whole lot of things because they can't, for example, turn their head, so that would not be a good way to go. But what you can do, they're very, very good at sucking right off the bat. And so you can use their sucking rate. This is hooked to a computer. And you can use their sucking rate to determine what they can and what types of distinctions they can and cannot make. And so if you look at babies at birth and their distinctions among different languages, so these are different languages that are, the plot here represents the rhythmic distinctions between different languages. So if you look at languages like English, Dutch, French, their structures of vowels and consonants, the way they're structured in terms of that varies. And so we linguists have a metric of rhythmic differences between these different languages. And so if you plot that, you will see that Japanese, in terms of how the vowels and consonants are structured, is pretty distinct from English. And so we can come up with different rhythmic classes, and those are the kinds of things that babies can actually perceive through the womb, right? So they may not be able to hear the exact phonetic distinctions, but they can hear differences in rhythmic patterns, and those are the types of distinctions that they actually can hear at birth. And so then if you look at bilingual babies, so bilingual newborns, what is that? Of course, they're not yet speaking, but babies whose parents used two languages when they were in utero, right? They actually prefer their two languages over other languages at birth, and they can discriminate or distinguish between their two languages if those two languages are in two different rhythmic classes. Right, so if they're kind of on the far ends, these may be difficult to discriminate between these two at birth, but if they're English and Japanese, that should be doable. So they already come to the world with certain things that they have learned in utero. And then, of course, once they're born, one of the cool things about newborns, very young infants, is that they can actually perceive differences among all the sounds of the world's languages. This is something that you and I can no longer do, right? But a baby who's born in Seattle in a monolingual English-speaking family, they can actually hear phonetic differences in sounds among French, among Japanese, all kinds of languages between birth and about 6 months of age. And then by about 1 year of age, they become selectively sensitive to the phonetic distinctions in their own language and start to lose the ability to hear the phonetic distinctions in other languages. Now, this is very normal. It happens to everybody. And it's a good thing because what that allows you to do is to become specialized in your own language or a combination of languages if you're learning two. So how do babies do this? I'm going to show you a little video of two moms speaking in what we call infant-directed speech. So let's see if the sound works. Oh, I guess not. Okay. So if you have a person, a mom here, I'm not sure why the video is not playing, but we'll deal. We'll get to different videos later. So if you have a mom who's speaking English and a mom who's speaking Japanese, right? You will hear different sounds in these two distinct inputs. So if you have a mom who's speaking English, you will hear lots of English ra sounds and lots of English la sounds, and no Japanese ra sounds, which is somewhere in between these two, right? So each language has its own inventory of sounds. And so if you are hearing English, you will hear lots of English ra's and English la's and none of the Japanese ra's. If you are hearing Japanese, the situation is reversed. You will not be hearing English ra's and la's, but you will be hearing the Japanese ra's. So over time, as you hear more and more language input, you will build a category of the Japanese ra, but not these two. And so this happens sometime between 6 and 12 months of age. So if we look at then American infants' discrimination or distinguishing between English ra's and la's, they will become increasingly good during this time period of 6 to 12 months of age. This discrimination between ra and la will go up in American infants, and it will go down in the Japanese infants because they're not hearing that English language. Of course, if we looked at the Japanese discrimination of the Japanese sounds, the situation would be reversed, right? So now the question is, of course, we are here at a bilingual school. What happens if you're hearing both of these languages, right? Can the brain handle doing this trajectory in two languages simultaneously? And so those are the types of studies that we can, the types of questions that we can solve by looking at baby brains. And we use magnetoencephalography. That's one methodology that we use at the Institute for Learning and Brain Sciences. This looks like a very intimidating machine, like a hairdryer from Mars is what we call it. But it's actually very, safe and completely non-invasive. It's also silent. So this is not like the MRI. Has anybody had an MRI before? So the MRI is very loud and a little bit intimidating. Actually, you have to be still like a statue. This one is more like going on a car ride. Now they still have to be still because the magnetic sensors are inside this helmet. So if you have a baby who's climbing out, that's a problem because you're no longer collecting data. So we are masters and experts in making babies sit in this car seat. It takes a lot of work, and this job is a very popular job at the Institute for Learning and Brain Sciences. It's called a toy waver. So there is a person who is in front of the baby waving toys to make sure that they're just kind of still and not moving. It's very hard because if you are too exciting, they'll start to climb out. If you are too boring, they will start to cry. So it takes a lot of skill. Anyway, so this is how this looks like in real life. So so parents will bring babies into the lab, and we prepare them for data collection by first putting them in a chair. Then we put a little cap on, and then we use a pen to track the shape of their heads. And this is done so that later when the baby's in the helmet, if she moves, we know at all times where the signal is coming from. And then she goes into this magnetically shielded room with her dad. They put her in this high chair. See, this is our toy waver here, doing her magic. And then the baby goes into the high chair. and she will sit there by herself, and then the dad just sits right next to her during data collection. And then I'll show you what data collection looks like. It's, here we go, here she is. We'll see if the sound works. But, da, 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 da. So not all babies are like this. So, but some are. What you're not seeing again is there's a person in front of her waving twice, right? But they have to do this for 18 minutes. The experiment goes for 18 minutes, and most of them actually make it through just fine. We have bubbles, it's fun. But you know, some of them drop out at 15 minutes, so the longer they stay still, the better. And so if we look at bilingual babies versus monolingual babies, when we do data collections like this, so what you heard were these sounds, das and tas. In this particular study, we looked at the sounds of Spanish and English. So half of the babies came from bilingual Spanish, English-speaking families where they heard both Spanish and English. Half of them were monolingual. They're all 11 months of age, and what they heard here was sounds that were in some cases specific to Spanish, some were specific to English, and some were common in both languages. So then the question is, can they discriminate, can the bilingual babies discriminate between both sets of sounds, and what do monolingual babies do? So what we found here was that babies who came from Spanish and English bilingual families, they were actually they showed strong brain responses to both languages. They were equally strong to Spanish and to English versus monolingual babies at 11 months of age. They showed a strong response to English, but not to Spanish. So what that tells us is that the babies are definitely listening, and that by 11 months of age, their brains are selectively sensitive to the language or languages that are present in the environment. And so then we had another finding, though, which was that in the prefrontal cortex, so this is the very front of your brain, here, right here, the responses in the bilingual babies were actually stronger compared to monolingual babies. And this is interesting because we know from some adult studies that bilingual adults oftentimes have enhanced executive functioning. So executive functioning is this ability to shift attention, to switch back and forth between doing different tasks. I like to think about it it's like an airport control tower, right? Where you have all these different things coming in from different directions, and executive functioning is a skill that allows you to make sure nothing crashes. So in bilingual babies here, we saw enhanced brain functioning in these prefrontal areas, and that's interesting because we know from other studies that executive functioning, this is where executive functioning tends to happen in the human brain, and bilingual adults have enhanced executive functioning. So this seems to suggest that perhaps even at 11 months of age, shifting back and forth between different languages provides some kind of exercise for the brain to be able to later on give bilingual kids an edge, right? To be stronger in tasks that require executive functioning. So what is this executive functioning? What is it? How do you do this on a day-to-day basis? I'll do a little demo. So to test your executive functioning. Is everybody ready? Yeah? Okay. So what we're going to do here is, as fast as you can, I'm going to ask you to name the color of each word instead of reading the word. So we're not going to read words. We're going to name their colors. Okay? Not going to read words. We're going to name their colors. Ready? I'm not hearing it.
Yellow, blue,
Black, orange. Okay. So we're gonna do a new set now. We're gonna do a new set. Ready?
We did good on that one.
We're doing the same thing. Everybody ready? Okay. I want to hear you. Okay. So what did I do to you? So which group was easier? The first group was easier, right? Now, another thing I'll tell you is that if you took your preschoolers, 3-year-olds who don't know how to read yet, they would smoke you. But jokes aside, so what happened here? So in the first set, if you actually read, you were fine because the color matches the meaning of the word, right? In the second set, if you read, you got the wrong answer. But I told you not to read, right? But you still did it. So the thing that happens is that reading in us, we're all proficient readers, right? So it's such an automatic thing to do. When you see a word, you read it. And so what you had to do to be successful here is you had to inhibit this automatic response and give green light to this other thing that I told you to do, right? But it was hard. You had to stop one process and give green light to another process. So you had to, and here you could cheat, right? You could do either one and it worked, here it didn't. And so this is the type of task that tends to be enhanced in those who regularly switch back and forth between different languages. And the thinking behind it is that if you are in a situation where you are constantly dealing with this conflict resolution, right? Like, oh, which language now? I'm gonna say no to this one and yes to this one, that you get more exercise doing that, and that's why you tend to be better. Now, why are the preschoolers better at this? Because their reading is not as automatic yet, right? So they'll actually listen to me and do what I tell them. So, but we can actually test executive functioning in preschoolers. We would just have to do a different task, right? Reading wouldn't be a good way to go because it's not as automatic yet. Anyway, so now what I hope to have demonstrated is that something as complex as bilingualism, it's not just something that affects our language processing. It affects how we think generally. It affects our cognition. And the next question I want to address is, does it actually affect brain structure? Does what we hear in the language input, the types of languages that we're hearing, the amount of language we're hearing, does it affect how our brains are structured? So if we look at MRI images, and this is just a very simplistic view of an example infant, 5-year-old and an adult, and this is a picture is taken like this, right? So the front of the brain will be there, and this is the back of the brain. So what I want to focus on is this arc here that we see. And so what you notice here is that it gets the white matter, we call it myelin, so it's the fatty tissue that wraps around the brain cells. We have more and more myelin over time. So there's in the infant brain, if we look at this particular tract, it's a one-way road. In the 5-year-old brain, it becomes a 2-way highway. And when we look at an adult, this becomes a 5-lane highway, right? So over time, myelin grows. And this is helpful because myelin is like insulation of wires. It helps make communications between different parts of the brain faster. Okay, it's literally like insulation. So the question here is, can we say that these measures of myelin thickness, are they related to what we hear in the input? Is this just something that grows over time without communicating with the environment, or does the environmental input actually have an impact on how much myelin we have in certain parts of the brain? So when we think about measuring children's language input, it's actually something we can, in this day and age, measure pretty precisely. So we can measure children's language experiences in different ways. One way that I like to use is we have these little LANA recorders. They're called language environment analysis recorders. They're recorders about this big that we can fit into chest pockets of children's t-shirts. And then we press record, and this recorder will actually record everything that the baby hears and produces over a 16-hour day. And then we can analyze these recordings automatically to determine things like how many words does the baby hear over a day, and how many conversational turns they're taking. So what's a conversational turn? That would be a back and forth exchange between a parent and a child, or a teacher and a child. So I'll show you an example of what a conversational turn is. This is just going to be sound, not video. This will be in Spanish, but you guys are a multilingual crowd, so I think you.
Oye, Niki. Guitarra. Guitarra. Ajá.
Okay, so you heard the dad's talking about the guitar, and then she said da da, and then the next time it's da da. It's a little closer, right? So it's this back and forth where parent says something, baby tries to imitate it, and the parent goes back. So the back and forth exchanges, or serve and return interactions of this type, actually now are known to be linked to all kinds of measures, cognitive measures, pre-literacy abilities, and so on. So, and the thinking behind it is that it's this contingent feedback that babies are getting through back and forth exchanges that is creates a feedback loop, right? So it's a baby serves, parent returns something that is related exactly to what the baby says, and that's what makes the language grow. So we know that the amount of turn taking, so the number of turns like this that happens during the day, has been shown to be linked to vocabulary growth, for example, executive functioning, socio-emotional development, pre-literacy skills, literacy skills. So all kinds of positive outcomes are actually related to the amount of turn taking that the baby engages in. Now, our question was, is it also related to brain structure? Can we link the amount of turn taking that a baby has with something like the thickness of their white matter tracts in the brain? And I probably wouldn't be telling you about this if the answer was no. So it's yes. So this is a recent study that came out after the pandemic. Data was collected before the pandemic, and then we took forever to analyze it. And so what we did here was we actually took MRIs with 26-monthers. I'm going to pause here to just let you think about this for a second. What do 26-monthers look like? So if you tell them to be still like a statue, what do you think they're going to do? They're not going to be still like a statue. So what we do here is they actually are asleep for these. And we don't sedate them. They sleep naturally during an MRI. So they come to the lab at like 9 or 10 at night. And then they do their routine. You read them books, parents are there. It's great. So then around 2 a.m. is when all of this happens. And they sleep right through it. Some. We actually have a very good success rate. We're about 80% successful. And if they wake up and they go home, and some of them decide to come back and try again, and it's successful. Anyway, so 26-monthers, we are focusing on an area of the brain, or a pathway in the brain that's called the arcuate fasciculus. So an easy way to think about the arcuate fasciculus is it's the tract that connects the areas of the brain that are linked to language production or speaking and language comprehension or listening. It's an arc. And so here we are measuring whether the thickness of this tract is linked to the amount of turn taking that these babies experience between 6 and 18 months of age, and it is. So the number of conversational turns that the baby has between 6 and 18 months of age is directly linked to the thickness of their arcuate fasciculus, this tract that connects the speaking and listening parts of the brain. And by the way, this has been shown before we did our study with 26-monthers. This has been also shown in 5-year-olds. right? So we know in 5-year-olds this is the case, but in 2-year-olds we were the first ones to show that. Now, 5-year-olds are a different beast because you can actually tell them to be still in the MRI, and for the most part, they can do it, right? You can tell them they're going on a space shuttle or other things, but they don't actually have to be asleep for the most part. Anyway, so what I hope I have communicated here is that the language interactions that children have, so things like turn taking, yes, they're very important for their success in school, for their vocabulary size, for their executive functioning, for social emotional relations that they build, but they actually also build their brains. They're related to their brain structure. And for children learning 2 languages, these interactions actually have to happen in both languages, not just in one. When you think about bilingualism, there are different ways to becoming bilingual. You guys know this, right? There are bilingual babies who start learning both languages from birth, but then there are also children who learn one language when they're very young, and they come to school to learn another language at school, and both ways can work. So it tends to be the case that brains are more plastic in earlier life or moldable, right? The environment also often is more conducive to language learning at an early age, right? Babies tend to be bathed in language, right? They talk, they're surrounded by language day in and day out. If you think of a bilingual child, that may not always be the case for both languages, right? So if we're speaking one language at home for the first 5 years, yes, they're going to be bathed in that one language, but then maybe they've never heard this second language, right? And they come to school to learn that language, so it's not always the case that both languages are available from the start, and that's okay too. So sequential bilingualism can be very successful also. There are many, many factors besides just age that dictate how successful a child can be in acquiring 2 languages. So frequency of use, right? Context in which this child will learn language. Are they acquiring literacy in one or in both languages? That's a big one because literacy can be a pathway to very successful and proficient language use. And then, yes, while a lot of this stuff begins very early on in utero, it doesn't end there. So supporting both languages through the school years is key. Yes, if language learning does begin very early on, but there's a lot of work to be done throughout the school years as well. If we look at the elementary school years, oftentimes you'll hear that by the time children are 5 years old, they're done learning language. That's actually not the case. Their vocabulary during the elementary years increases a lot. It goes from about, these are estimates, from about 10,000 words at kindergarten entry to over 40,000 by the time they go to middle school. So that's about 20 new words each day on average, just in the elementary years. And of course, a lot of this is done through the development of literacy, right? So literacy development in both languages is key, and also that will be the way in which they acquire the academic language too. So just out of curiosity, 21 minutes of independent reading per day gives you about 2 million words per year. So to sum up, language is a dynamic system that keeps changing throughout the lifespan. Yes, a lot of it happens early on, but we still, even as adults, we are still growing our language or languages. It's a dynamic system that continues to change. So the work is not done in infancy. And bilingualism and multilingualism, they shape not only language development, but also cognitive development and brain structure. So when you are talking to your child, you literally are changing and building their brains. Finally, we have known for quite a while, and I hope I have convinced you today that the infant brain is actually prepared to learn 2 or more than 2 languages from the start. Remember, at 11 months of age, you can see that those babies who are bathed in 2 languages can actually successfully process 2. Cognitive flexibility has been shown to be enhanced in some bilinguals. Now, this is something that can be contentious. Some people say that this is not the case. One problem in bilingualism research is that it's actually hard to define how bilingual is bilingual, right? When can you expect that somebody will actually show executive function advantage? How bilingual do they have to be? Does it have to be? Is it enough to have 2 years of Spanish in high school? Probably not, right? So what we don't know is how bilingual do you have to be to get this executive function advantage. So it depends on who you measure. But those who are in constant conflict resolution situations tend to have this advantage. And then finally, the language growth that you will see in children is related to not just the amount of language input that they get in each language, but the quality of input that they get in each language as well. So supporting both or all languages, not just in infancies, but throughout the school years will be key to being proficient and maintaining that proficiency throughout life. And that's all I have. Thank you.